I think for me, arcade art has been underappreciated. We see a lot of interest in comic book art and other forms of pop art, and it's almost been elevated to the point where it's now considered to be legitimate art in its own right. It's in galleries and it's in exhibitions, and it's pretty much mainstream. And I think gaming, particularly arcade gaming, has been as much of a kind of pop culture influence as anything else. Yet it seems to be massively underappreciated, and I wanted to make sure that this archive of arcade artwork that I'd managed to collect together was seen by as many people as possible. And really, it was a book that if I could have bought it, I would have gone out and bought the thing. And I remember sitting there, I looked through Amazon, I looked on a bunch of other kind of book websites, and found pretty much nothing. There was a reasonable amount about the games themselves, a lot about the development work, but very little about the artwork. And as a kid, I had not a huge amount of money. I spent a lot of time in arcades with no money in my pockets. So I ended up wandering around looking at the machines more than I did playing the games. So the artwork, I think, became really important to me. And I knew more. If you give me the name of a machine, I don't think of the game immediately, I think of the artwork, because that's what I saw as a kid. So the fact that that book didn't exist, I kind of complained about it for a while, and then realised that as a guy with access to the material and the ability to do the creative part, it's probably down to me to do something about it. And essentially that's where the book came from. I love about arcade art, one of them being it just takes me back to being a kid, to those holidays with parents and a slightly annoying younger brother, where we'd wander around the arcades, and it was probably the one time of year where we did have money in our pockets and we could spend it, you know, doing crazy things like pumping it into a machine that we weren't very good at. And it just really brings that back. So it's partly the pure nostalgia of it from a personal perspective. The other side of it is that it's the fact that it's underappreciated. And I look at some pieces, and there are some games, I'm not going to mention any names, but they're clearly being drawn by a guy with a pencil and a ruler and a radius gauge. And they are what they are, they're of the era. But they're not necessarily what I'd consider art. There are other pieces that are just mind-blowing. So pieces like Moon Patrol, which is where all of this started really, was me digitally restoring the Moon Patrol marquee and looking at it and thinking, this would look perfect gracing the pages of a comic book. And it stands alone as a piece of artwork in its own right. And there's just something about that. It's the association with the history and the fact that it means so much to so many people, and it's a shared cultural experience, and it spans kind of mid to late 70s, I guess, all the way through to mid 90s, late 90s, when the arcades really took a tumble. All this started for me really was with collecting and restoring some machines. I ended up with a group of guys and we got into collecting new old stock toys. And that gave us access, after some detective work, to some toy warehouses that really had closed their doors in the late 80s and had never opened them again. And we managed to get access to them, and we had truckfuls of old 80s toys. And that kind of really ignited that nostalgia to me, to a point where I decided that what I really wanted to do was to take it one step further, and rather than just have the tabletop version of some of these games, was to have the arcade machine version of some of these games. And at that point, which was probably 2001, 2002, there wasn't a huge arcade collecting community in the UK particularly. and games were relatively inexpensive. So I bought a whole bunch of games and realised very quickly that they'd had a hard life. They'd spent 30, 40 years being abused in arcades and in warehouses, and they needed a bit of restoration. So I got in touch with a company in the US that did restoration work, mostly for movies, and they were very, very helpful. So I restored some machines, and that was great. The next time I called them, they told me that they were getting out of the arcade machine restoration business and focusing purely on pinball. And so I asked the fateful question of, what are you going to do with the artwork that you've got for arcade machines? And they offered to sell it to me. They gave me a price, and the cost of paying that price was for me to sell every arcade machine that I owned, was to dump all my savings, despite my partner's protesting, into this thing, and to buy that arcade archive. And it was something that I felt that needed to be saved, because if it hadn't been me, I couldn't imagine that anyone else was about to pay the kind of money that it took. At the time, it felt like a pretty stupid move, but I couldn't say no. And that's how I ended up with a massive archive of arcade artwork, most of it in fairly poor condition that needed a huge amount of restoration. And yeah, Photoshop to the rescue. Deciding on the format for the book and the overall style was quite a tough one, because just by the nature of the size and shape of an arcade machine, you've got a whole bunch of very, very different pieces of artwork. So some 3:1 aspect ratio landscape marquees with a much more kind of a standard rectangular portrait style screen bezel. The control panels, again, are a landscape, and then the side art can be a multitude of shapes and sizes. So originally, I really wanted to include all different types of arcade art, and it quickly became apparent that standardising on either just the marquees or just the side art was the way to go. And the marquees really lend themselves to a A4 landscape. By the time you've opened up those pages, they are the perfect size. So, and they're fairly close to one-to-one when it comes to the machines themselves. So that kind of made the decision for me. I think the catalyst for all of this was Moon Patrol. The Moon Patrol marquee to me is the best of them all. It stands alone as a piece of artwork. It works as a real strong attention grabber for the machine. And the Larry Day's style of art it suits the format perfectly. That's definitely my #1 favourite. Another one that I really love is Deathrace, just because it caused such controversy. 1976, it predates the Deathrace movie, and it was a video game targeted at kids where the premise of the game is to run over as many pedestrians as possible. It fits perfectly with that game, and it's also the first game I ever played in an arcade. So that was 6-year-old me and 4-year-old brother playing Deathrace in an arcade in Swanage in the UK. Yeah, that brings back a huge amount of memories for me. There are a couple of others that I really love, and occasionally it's because of the game. So Sinistar, the marquee's great. The game is absolutely astonishing. So that's a kind of an association of the quality of the game with the quality of the marquee. There are marquees in the book that are only there because the game is popular and was really great. Artwork itself, not so good. But yeah, they're few and far between. The vast majority of what's in there are things that I really love. It's been quite difficult to leave certain ones out. And that's always controversial when you pick up a book and it purports to be, you know, a browser book, coffee table book full of everyone's favourite arcade artwork, and your particular game's not in there. I hope people understand. A couple that I left out for legal reasons. We could have pushed, and they could be in the book, but there are some good reasons why they're not in there. There are one or two where I just simply could not get quality artwork to work from. Space Harrier isn't in there, and it really should be, and I did manage to get through Arcade Club a really, really good, pretty close to new old stock marquee. But for some reason, Space Harrier used such thick plastic on it that it was impossible to get it to scan properly. It just is absolutely impossible to scan that marquee because it's nearly 7mm of perspex between the artwork and the scanner, and it just doesn't work. And the one thing I said I wouldn't do was redraw any of the artwork for the book. Everything in that book is original restored artwork. It's not a reimagining, it's not a vector file of the original. So there are a few, not quite regrets, but there are a few in there that maybe they'll be in another one. One of the most difficult things in this entire exercise has been tracking down the original artists. Most were never credited. Very few marquees are signed. The ones that are signed, quite often they're unintelligible. And long conversations with Atari, with Sega, with Nintendo, Bally, Midway, Williams, all of those organisations, and they pretty much all told me the same thing. They farmed out the artwork. A lot of it went to advertising posters in Chicago, who are mostly famous for doing pinball, backglass and playfields. And they seem to keep a lot more records for the pinball artwork than they did for the arcade stuff. It was such a compressed time period from kind of 1979 to 1985 that they were just producing these things just, you know, one or two a day in some cases. No records were kept, and very, very few of those marquees in the book we can associate with artists. So finding Larry Day, based on his signature on the Moon Patrol marquee, was a bit of a coup. And that first tentative email to Larry, just ask him very, very politely in that very English way that I tend to work in, of are you the guy and will you speak to me about it, was that was an interesting one. And Larry and I have traded numerous messages over the past couple of years. He's been really helpful in filling in some of the gaps, putting me in touch with other artists that he remembers that were never credited. And what Larry did for me was pulled out some of the original concept artwork. So these are his own pencil drawings and drawings on tissue paper and the composites, literally back in the day when they would cut and paste. He sent me artwork where he has physically cut and pasted pieces together. And to give us permission to use those in the book is something a bit special. This is something that no one has ever seen before. He pulled these out of his personal archive, and some of them are for games that were only ever rumoured to be in development that never made it to market. So a good example of that is Screw Loose. It was a game that there's one example of a board that's been found, and it was rumoured to have been in development. It never got quite finished, and it was never quite clear whether this was really destined to be a game. Well, it turns out that Larry Day produced Sharpie marker pen concept artwork for that game. So that answers one of the questions that's been bugging arcade fans for years. And there are other marquees that he produced, Conquest being a good one. Now that appears in the Arcade Museum archive as a rumoured game with no information about it whatsoever, but we have the scan of a fully finished marquee for that game. So it's been absolutely fascinating, and it's been a kind of a chain of events where Larry's answered a lot of questions, he's shared a lot of his own personal experiences with me, and then he's put me in touch with other people So it's answered a lot of questions and filled in a lot of blanks, and we now get to credit at least some of the people that created this stuff, whose names have never been mentioned before. There's a slight tinge of sadness to some of this. Python Anghelo, who is most famous for creating the Joust artwork and for being a hell of a character as well. I knew he was ill, and I was kind of debating whether I should get in touch with him or not. I managed to get in touch with his sister, who told me it would be okay. And I got to interview Python a couple of times about his history, and he was very keen to get some of this stuff recorded. He'd been interviewed quite a few times about his pinball artwork, but I think almost never about the arcade video game pieces. And I think I spoke to him in the February, and it was a couple of months later that Python died. So it means a lot to me, and again, I've spoken to a couple of his family members, and it means a lot to them that this has now been recorded. It's not lost with Python, it's now recorded, and people get to know more of his story. That means a lot. The original concept for the book, in my mind, was that it would literally just be a browser book of artwork in no particular order, and it would be almost like a treasure hunt. You could flick through it and find favourites that you remember for the old days, and then come across things you'd never seen before, and it was fairly unstructured. And having got all the artwork together and completed that part of it, I flicked through the PDF file, and it felt like there was something missing. There was more of a story to be told, and that was some of the history, some of the background. And rather than overlay any text or any credits or an artist credit even over the top of the artwork, I really wanted that to remain clean, as if you could hold it up and imagine that it's the front of the machine. So what I ended up doing was creating a small write-up in the back of the book for every single marquee, and I've included as much detail as I can in there. And in some cases there isn't a huge amount of information about each marquee. So rather than talk about the game, and this is a book about the artwork, not the game, I've included as much detail about the artwork, a bit of a critique perhaps, and where we've got it, any trivia or details about the artwork's creation, and where we can, on those rare occasions, a credit for the artist. One of the questions that does come up, particularly for those that are not really embedded in the gaming world or the arcade world in particular, is, well, is this really artwork? It's more advertising, or it's just something to pretty up the black chipboard box that the game lives in. And for me, it's the first thing that you see when you hit the arcade. It's what attracts you to one game over another game. If your game of choice is Defender, you can scan an arcade and you can spot the game that you want from afar because you know what the Defender looks like. If you only ever play Scramble, then you're looking for a bright red marquee that stands out a mile. If you play Super Cobra, then strangely for a game about a helicopter gunship, you're looking for a bright pink and yellow marquee, which only the Japanese can do this. But my answer to the question, is it art, it takes me back once again to Moon Patrol. That speaking to Larry Day about the original artwork that he had, and when I asked if he would share any of it with me, he sent me scans of his original works and then a photograph of the original black and white Moon Patrol artwork on his son's wall. So long before I got in touch with him and started talking to him about arcade artwork, it already was art. It lives in a frame on the wall of his son's apartment. That kind of bears out my argument that yes, this absolutely is art.